director, yes. Okay, we are recording. So, um, Sam Gindin, we have a letter of consent form here that asks you to agree to some conditions that are therein. I won't read them to save time and be efficient, but you have read them and you agree that it's acceptable what we're asking you to do
Yes,
today,
definitely.
and that you'll send us a hard copy when you have a moment to print it out.
I'll do that today or tomorrow.
Thank you so much. What I got, I read a little bit out of Bob White's book, and it looks like you were pretty key. I was going to say right hand man, but he in fact called you his left arm man in the book. So he obviously confided in you and trusted you a great deal in the whole operation of what was going on in the UAW that became the CAW. Could you talk a little bit about, okay, how did you get to that point where you were starting with the union? Where were you, and what was going on in your life, and then your involvement with the union, and then we'll work into how SACTU comes into it.
Okay, I'll try to do that relatively quickly, but I'm from Winnipeg, Manitoba, which has a long culture. The north end of Winnipeg had a long time culture of left radicalism. During the McCarthy period, we elected a communist alderman, only place probably in North America that was doing that. I went to school in the States. And I didn't want to become an academic. I tried to get a job with unions. I wrote to every union that there was. Most of the jobs were in the States. I actually wrote to Detroit, and my partner said she wouldn't come with me if I went to Detroit, but I was going to go there anyways. And then they got a job in Canada. Canadians, it was approved that Canadians could start a research department, so I went there. So I started working in 1974. I think the important points about this was that the auto workers were, I think, at a peak in terms of their strength at the time. They were militant through the 60s, and in Canada, unlike the United States, they were militant through the 70s. And there was a history of that. It had very much to do with the things that a lot of Americans began to take for granted. In Canada, we actually had to fight for just to keep up at the time. So there was a tradition of militancy, and I think I was hired really out of that there was a sense in the union leadership that there was a left, which in fact they were trying to co-opt. And I think they hired me and another Black person who wasn't actually very radical as part of giving the union a left image, at the same time as that they were actually following the waffle, which was the left-wing trend in the NDP. So they were trying to kick that out at the same time, but they were actually adopting a lot of its attitudes. And I think I was hired on that basis. So I was there to start a research department. I had influence because I was the research. They depended on me for research, but to maintain that influence, I had to do my job, something that women know about, twice as well as anybody normally would have had that job. So I actually felt like I had two jobs, just to establish my credibility and that they would trust me. And then in addition to that, I felt like I was there as a socialist. So I had to do as much as I could in terms of raising socialist issues. So I felt like I had three jobs, and I really was kind of going crazy. Eventually, more than a decade later, we ended up with a research department of 10 people, mostly all people on the left. I would say the majority of the Marxists, vast majority. So I came to the union at a good time, and just, you should know that the auto workers were unique in this sense, and I think it's true, even though I'm not a labor historian. Of unions that had a left in them, two kinds of things happened. Either the left was destroyed during the McCarthy period, or very much marginalized, or in those few places where the left actually took over the leadership of the union, like in Mine Mill, they were kicked out of the labor movement. in auto in Canada, there were, and this happened in the States with, Luther firing hundreds of staff after he came to power. The difference in Canada is that the left was strong enough to be sustained, but not that strong that they had to be kicked out. So there was actually a left culture, some sense of links to the left. They supported UE when it was being kicked out. They, not by much, it was by maybe 50, a little over 50%, but there was that kind of support. The left was always seen as a loyal opposition, I'd say, in the Union. So I was coming into that context, which was pretty unique. There was no paranoia about somebody being on the left. They were just waiting to see what I would do rather than immediately distrust me. And that was different. Within a week of coming on staff at the CAW, UAW at the time in Canada, a steel worker came up to me, somebody who was on the left, and he said, "You're on the blacklist." And I said, "What do you mean? I just got here. I haven't done anything." And he said, "Someone saw you have lunch with Saigonic in Winnipeg."
Oh,
The left-wing professor. And he said, "And we have a person in the office who keeps a filing cabinet on everybody in the trade union movement on the left." And he said, "And you've just been put on it." And this really came out of their ties to the Social Democratic Party, to the NDP. There was a lot of paranoia and a lot of discussions between Social Democrats and the UAW in the States about the left in Canada. So the UAW in Canada was unique in terms of not, the leadership weren't, they weren't communists, they weren't on the left, but they were not paranoid about the left, and they had respect for the left. So that's the context that I came in.
And if I'm not mistaken, it was also a peak union time. There was still a lot of support for unions. Unions were making gains and visible gains.
There was a big difference between Canada and the States. By the early 70s, the UAW and the labor movement generally in the US had kind of reached its peak. You had the rebellions in Lordstown. You had, it was part of a youth rebellion, a rebellion against authority. But that was the peak of it. And then it began to decline by the early 70s, by the energy crisis in the mid 70s. That was kind of the peak of it. And the labor movement was starting to be attacked. And it was really attacked primarily by letting unemployment rise. There was a great quote in Time magazine that there wasn't enough room on sidewalks for picket signs and unemployment lines. Basically, that you had to make a choice between them. But in Canada, that didn't happen. Canada actually maintained the labor movement in Canada maintained its militancy through the 70s. The public sector in particular was growing, and that was setting standards. And that was part of the basis for the eventual split, because we were starting to look more at what was happening in Canada than the whole history of our union, which was to look to the United States. So in Canada, the mood was still very militant. There were strikes in rail. The posties were growing. So the mood in Canada was very good. And I think one of the roles that I played was when I came to Canada in 74, and there was the beginning of this turn to neoliberalism. Started early, it didn't really emerge till the late 70s, early 80s, but there was a sense of trying to break workers' expectations, that the post-war period was over, that things had to be changed, and workers couldn't maintain their high expectations. And I thought of it as we could actually maintain the strength of the union, in a sense, by being conservative, simply by saying, no, we didn't want to change what had been going on. It wasn't a radical notion. And that echoed in the union, Bob White in particular, but also with Dennis McDermott. And so from 74 to 78, we were just being stubborn in terms of fighting against the trends in North America, in the United States, and against the state trends towards concessions. And then Bob White became president. And he really started off by building his reputation on that. The main message we were saying was no to cutbacks, no to concessions. And, by the time Bob left, it was harder to just say no. When Buzz came in, I think he had a much more difficult time, because you had to have an alternative and you had to be part of a much larger movement. So that was kind of the context in the mid-70s, a militant union. And I don't know if you want to link this now to South Africa, but I can, because there's an
Well,
important link.
that's exactly the question I was going to ask. With all these other things going on, how does the union get time for international solidarity?
Yeah, so I thought your question on time was a good one. And there's an irony here that unions that aren't, and I think I'm right about this, I'm doing this based on my own experience, but also watching other unions. Unions that aren't in struggle find out that they don't actually have much time anyways. They end up doing bureaucratic things. Bureaucratic things seem to, possess them and obsess them. They're not doing much, so they're worried about maintaining control. People who are working in the union are more concerned with whether they're getting credit for something or blamed for something. And when you actually are in struggles, you actually get energized. For one, you get more people active, but there's an energy that comes from that. And I think that was an important thing in our union. It wasn't that they had less time because they were in motion. It actually turned out that they had more time. Now, how much they could commit to things was another question. In other words, they had more time to think about issues like South Africa and support things, but it didn't mean that they had the time to do it. So the second thing that was so important in the union was that there are actually people who are going to do the work. And that's why Jane and Brenda and the two Kens were so important. And my role was mostly, I think, mediating that. We could get good resolutions passed. That wasn't too hard. There was some debate about how you got workers on side. And my argument always was that doing it instrumentally wasn't the way. Making the argument that you needed solidarity because it was good for you, otherwise the global South would take your jobs, wasn't a good argument. People weren't actually worried about South Africa taking our jobs. It's unstable and etc. So that didn't work. And I always thought that what actually motivates workers, even workers who are relatively conservative, is seeing other people in struggle. That's what moves them. And that the best message was actually telling our members that, look, there are people in struggle. They're actually fighting. They're fighting dogs, they're fighting police, they're fighting jailing, and they're risking their lives. And it's about, the demand to be treated like a human being. And not because you're Black. And that resonated. So I think that was one thing that was very important. But still, so I didn't find it hard to make the case that South Africa apartheid was bad, and we should pass good resolutions. I don't think that was that hard in other unions. The question is, what were you going to do about it? So that raised two questions. Yeah, what was your message? How are you going to find the time to really make a commitment? The labor movement is wonderful at passing good resolutions, and they don't matter. They're nice, they create some space. That's not the issue. One of the problems with the Communist Party was it was always so happy to get good resolutions passed because they could show the international movement that it was progressive and achieving things. But that wasn't the test. The test was, what could you get the union to do with its structures? And that's where it was so important to have the SACTU committee, because my main role was to convince the leadership to give access to them, get some funding, but it was primarily to legitimate their going into our locals and making the case. And that was critical.
How'd you go about that?
I mean, first of all, so this was an organizing task, and it's really to the credit of them that they did it. I think if it was just up to me, I could have created more space. I would have gotten resolutions passed. I would have convinced them to have a speaker sometime. But the real, what SACTU really accomplished was going out there and doing this. So in terms of me convincing them, I think the biggest barrier was that the trade union movement the unions often farmed their international activity out to the international department of the CLC.
Oh boy.
So, and this is going to happen eventually in all struggles, that for a time there might be a consensus on who's on the right side, but there were always divisions of some kind. And as soon as there are divisions, it's a question of who do you trust? And because people aren't reading a lot and don't know that much about it, they institutionalize it. Well, we'll trust the CLC. That's their job. Or it's just easier. They don't want to get into a fight with the CLC or be accused of being the left or communists or radicals. So I think the biggest issue, aside from, I had some credibility just from, I think the way I would argue with them over other issues. I came to the union thinking that I wouldn't last long. So I was never worried about being identified as a lefty. I just assumed I'm not going to last here. And I also made a point of hanging around with the left in the union. At conventions, I would sit with the left. And that was just my way of saying, this is who I am. I'm not keeping it a secret, but you can trust me. I'm not going to give people secret documents or betray you. And so I was developing trust. That was the most important thing, that if I was saying something, and then it was a question of how you're articulating this, so I didn't think it was off the wall. But my main role was this fight with the CLC. I had to convince them that the CLC was taking a wrong position and that their position was actually based on their anti-communism and their bureaucratic links to the international structures. And, and the union really deserves credit for this. I mean, it was, and starting with McDermott. And I mean, McDermott was interesting because McDermott comes out of the right wing. He built part of his reputation by fighting communists. One of the staff people was kicked out of the union for he was a rep at GM, and he was kicked out of the union for conspiring with communists to oppose the collective agreement. And McDermott was a main part of getting rid of this guy. But he was a poor Irish kid, and his politics were very anti-discrimination and anti-apartheid. And when he was a sailor, he would go into South Africa and into Johannesburg with black comrades and go to bars just to defy it. And he was very important in the human rights legislation that evolved in Ontario. So McDermott was open to this. And McDermott was also, even though he was on the right, he was very sympathetic to the underground in Spanish fighting fascism. So, it's one of the things about trade unionists. There's a certain complexity in terms of their history. So McDermott was very open to this. But still, McDermott, he eventually wanted to be head of the Canadian Labour Congress. He was a little bit cautious. So it took some to get him to take this risk. He had actually, he did have to trust me to take this risk, and he kind of left me to do it. And Bob White was much more sympathetic. I think he really got what this fight was about, and he was quite ready to take sides when he became head in 78. So this is pre-SACTU committee.
Yeah.
But the question of South Africa was always, one of those things that was around. And it was, one of the questions you asked me was when I got active, and I couldn't remember it all, but I do remember at university in the 67 probably, going to, demonstrations against apartheid, forums against apartheid. Anyway, so I think that was a big part of the issue, dealing with, and it wasn't just the CLC. There was always good left people in Canada, like John Saul, who would normally not be with the CLC. It'd be too radical for them, but he aligned himself with the CLC and was opposed to SACTU when this happened. And for my part, I had to trust, Jane and the whole SACTU committee, because I wasn't doing all the studying of what was going on in South Africa. I didn't know what the splits were. And I think like the trade union movements around me, you listen and you get a sense of who's actually seems to be supportive of struggle and who seems to be finding excuses. Like I always remember, this is a side story, but I always remember Bob Nickerson. We had a delegation to Nicaragua. Yeah, it was Nicaragua. And Nickerson came out of the right. He was the staff person chosen by Bob to kind of be linked in with the right, and he'd know what the right was doing. And Nickerson goes there with the CLC delegation, and we brief him before he goes. And I do my bit on real unions and CIA-funded unions and everything else, not expecting him to buy this stuff, but he's going to go and see for himself. And he came back, and I said, so how did it go? And he said, shit, all the unions the CLC took us up to were obviously CIA fronts. They didn't care about fighting. And this is a right-wing guy who goes down there, and he said, and the first thing he did when he came back, he said, we got to collect all these computers that we don't need anymore. Every time we renew them, we got to send the old ones to Nicaragua. They need them. And he became very active on it. And, it came out of, in the right context, even trade unionists who moved to the right because of bureaucratic infighting or the general climate, a lot of them still retain that working class sensibility that it can get tapped into. And the way it gets tapped into is when there's a struggle. It doesn't get tapped into just trying to have an argument. And so the big thing that was making this happen was there was a struggle in South Africa. There was a SACTU committee that was actually organizing. And there was a union whose history was such that it was open. And in that context, I could play that mediating role. I couldn't have done this if I was in steel, for example. It wasn't like my personality was wonderful and I would have walked in and done this at steel. It was that context.
The whole conjuncture, as they call it in French.
Yes. And in English now. Pardon? That's a word in English now, too.
Is it? Okay. I never know where I am in Canada. So along comes the SACTU Solidarity Committee. They are organized, and it also seems that in the struggle that you talk about manifests itself by giving the locals and their members ways to participate in it and get involved, because they did.
Yeah. I can give you an example of a difference. When OCAP was organizing, this is much later.
I'm sorry, what's that?
OCAP, the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty.
Okay.
They're a radical group, one of the most radical groups in terms of actions in Ontario. So I remember taking a rank and file, a young woman who's a single mother living in poverty, and taking them to a meeting in Oshawa to make her case. And she talked about how hard life was and how things had to be changed. And again, I could get into Oshawa. I had links there. So she gives her pitch, and then they collected money to give her. That was the end result of it. It didn't end up to be a political thing. And the difference with the SACTU stuff was that they were going to workers, and they were going there with a political project. They weren't just looking for a handout. And if I remember this right, one of the demands at the local level was to make the case for a defense fund, that people were being thrown in jail, and this was a defense fund. It was fairly modest demand. It's not the most radical demand in the world, but it was something concrete. And workers could identify it with it. They could not just say, I helped somebody, one person by charity or something. They could actually feel like they were doing something concrete, but they knew that the struggle was going on there. Other things we did, and I think this might have been before SACTU. I can't remember the date now, because it seems to me in my head it was around 78. When the boycott was on, we would argue with our companies to take money out of the money that was being invested in South Africa, had to stop in our pension funds. So we did that. And then, that meant that we had to do some education, especially with bargaining committees. And I don't remember that being that difficult. It was just a question of, making it a priority and going and doing it. So the SACTU committee would speak to our councils, and that would give them links. And we would write letters to locals to let them come. But they went in and they did the work. And then the question is, and I think this is one of the questions you asked, so how much did this influence? Now, it obviously, it influenced the leadership. I mean, the leadership came to see that it was right, that in the fight with the CLC, that it was right. We could keep giving them the information to show them what was really going on the ground. We could bring in the speakers, and they could see the difference in the speakers who would be coming from the CLC or the ones that we would bring. So the leadership was strengthened, and that was very positive. Then at the local level, I'd say that one of the things that happened is that some people were recruited to make this a priority. There'd be a local union president or a local activist who would say, who'd get moved by this, and they would become very active. So, again, you were building an organization. I wouldn't say that in general, we created this massive people committed to this as a priority, but we did commit, I think, an impressive consciousness amongst workers that if this came up, which side they were on and why. And I think that was impressive international work. The speakers that we brought in were very important. You could, for workers to get access to somebody who's in this kind of a struggle in South Africa was always moving. And I thought that those kinds of speakers and tours were very important. I do remember one incident that I think was actually quite important. What was his name? Irwin. Was it Irwin? I'm not thinking of Irwin Jim. Alec Irwin.
Alec Irwin.
Oh, yeah.
Alec Irwin was a white South African, and like a lot of the South African whites who were progressive, had become very active as a student in the student movement against apartheid. Became very influential in NUMSA. He wasn't an elected leader, but like a lot of whites at that time, people who were white and educated and influential carried a lot of weight. He was education director. And then he eventually went into the state after apartheid. He was one of the people that ended up with he was actually, I think, a minister of industry for a while. Anyways, Alec, I think during this period, I can't remember whether it was after apartheid or before, I was brought to Canada to speak about support for South Africa, for the South African trade union movement. And this was completely about the CLC's counterattack on us. This was to have Alec speak for the formal trade unions that the CLC was supporting at the time and divide us. So we got a hold of him before he went in to give his talk. He had just arrived. We got him into a hotel room. I don't remember who was there. I remember that John Bettis from the aerospace local.
112.
Yeah, who was on the left, had a lot of problems, but he was very, very informed. Really smart guy, informed. I think his grandfather was one of the founders of the Communist Party in the early 20s in Canada, one of the 21 or so people that did this. So Bettis, we invited him into the meeting. And by the way, and at that time, Dias was very good on both apartheid and the Palestinian question, especially at that time. He was very, very good. So we invited Bettis into a meeting, and Ken Lockhart was there, and I can't quite remember who else was there. And we just told Alec what was going on. We just gave him our interpretation that you're being used, that this is part of the fight, that we're trying, we want unity. We're not shitting on the other unions, but we see our connection with SACTU as being very important. And he didn't give his talk. He told the CLC that he wasn't going to be used that way, and he went back to South Africa. And that was very impressive. I was impressed that he was quite ready to sacrifice a relationship to the CLC, which would have international repercussions. He was quite, ready to avoid playing that kind of sectarian role. And he was doing it on the basis of a few of us talking to him. So he was obviously doing this on things that he himself suspected or knew. It wasn't just that, what we told him he was going to believe. I think our credibility as lefties. So, that was also very important. That confirmed things to our leadership. So, so SACTU was, is a great example. And we tried to use SACTU as a model in other kinds of struggles. And, one of the key, one of the most important things about this is the left can moralize very well. And the left, is good at symbolic things like getting resolutions. And the left is always anxious to get some funding. And that's what the trade union movement does. But what it's not good at is actually organizing. And the difference here was that there were people who were organized their own lives. You know, Brenda and Jane and Ken and the two Kens two of them would work and try to get some money, and two of them would organize. And it was that organizing full time that made this happen. Otherwise, it would have been, you know, a good progressive thing that we could write something good about. It would have achieved something, but it wouldn't have achieved what was done. And I kept emphasizing this message to the movements. If you want to do this, this is what it has to be. You have to figure out ways of actually engaging workers and talking with them. And that takes a lot of time and commitment and priorities. And it isn't just symbolic actions. It isn't about a protest, which are fine, but they're the beginning of something.
Wow, what a magisterial overview. It's great. I really like where we're going here. This is you make the point about this is from your perspective as a CAW researcher and a militant, but they were also well connected to many other locals as well, and the CAW became a springboard for that too. I'm sure, but that's another story for SACTU to tell.
Yeah.
Well, look,
Can I just say something on that, which I also think is important, because, you know, I mean, I've been emphasizing the history of the union, but also its structure was important. The union, the reason that the left was so strong in the union was because a lot of the big plants were actually organized by communists. And so it gave the communists a base. That was one thing that was very important. They actually had a base at the local level. As the union consolidated, it tried to remove that base. It tried to centralize because of its own struggles with the left, the union leadership. I'm talking about in the 50s. And one of the ways it tried to centralize things, it tried to move the issues to wages and benefits and away from control over the workplace. Because the workplace was where the left was strong. And at the top, it was where the center would be strong in terms of general bargaining. And it was also the deal that they could make. I say deal loosely. It's never a firm deal, and there was always a lot of struggle over it. But it also made it easier for the union leadership at that time to get the companies to give them wages and benefits. And they would let the company rule the workplace, or try to rule the workplace at least, because the workers still resisted. And that would strengthen the union, because it was the union leadership, because it was getting wages and benefits. And it could establish its credibility that way. And it strengthened the company, because what they really wanted more than wage concessions ever was control of the workplace. That was always the most important thing to them. So there's that kind of a history in the union that was very important in terms of centralization. But the centralization was also a strength, because by the time of Dennis, and then especially of Bob, we were strong. And because we were strong, we could do things centrally. We could actually tell our locals, here's a plan, and we're going to try to carry it out. But the union was still, it still had its democratic traditions, democratic in the sense of participation from below, that we built strong locals. We didn't have fragmented locals the way CUPE, for example, did. We amalgamated them if they were small. And so we had strong locals. So we had two advantages. One is we could have a centralized policy. And two is that it could be carried out. So, you know, the fact that, you know, the union could tell locals, look, this is our project. We decided that it's a convention. You have to support it. And then a lot of the locals would carry it out. So it was a good dynamic. And that dynamic isn't always good, because when there isn't a left, it can be very problematic. The locals can start just doing whatever the center wants. There can be no check on the center. And that's eventually what happened, but that's a longer story. But I just want to emphasize too, it was the structure of the union at the time that facilitated this as well. Okay, go ahead with your questions.
Well, again, where you sat, of course, you were very, very much close to the leadership. But I've been a leader, a president of a local of two different CUPE and CEQ unions, and I know there's awful lot of democracy in the local level, and these things do get debated, and it's really quite interesting. And you make it sound so easy, where a resolution gets to the floor of the labor assembly at the top.
Yeah.
But it does take a lot of effort to get through all the stages to get it there. And
No, I shouldn't underestimate that. Just as an example, I'm working with something, Green Jobs Oshawa. It's an environmental conversion project. And one of the things we wanted to do is get a resolution passed at an NDP convention supporting us. And of course, I wasn't involved in this, but they worked hard to get this done. They got the resolution, and then they wouldn't let it on the floor because it came in a day late or something. And, so that's the kind of work you have to do. So what did they do? They actually organized on the floor, and they got some trade union leaders, like Fred from the provincial head of Fred. My head's blank.
Upshaw?
Pardon me?
Fred Upshaw? No, that's.
No, this is now Fred.
Is now.
Anyways, he's the Ontario head of QP. He spoke on it. Anyways, they got
Fred Hahn.
Yeah, Fred Hahn.
Yeah.
And they got it on the floor again. They forced the NDP, and to do that, you almost had to have, I think you had to have a unanimous vote. So they get it on the floor. I mean, they're doing all this work and they get the resolution passed. But my point was, they just got it passed. The NDP did nothing with it because the leadership wasn't interested in talking about public ownership or threatening General Motors. So I just mean that, we can get tied down in resolutionism.
Yes.
It's good because you're doing education. For us, it was a way to raise the issue, and that's good. And it legitimates you. We walk around saying we got this resolution passed and the NDP supports it. But the real issue is organizing around it, doing something about it. And that's the only reason that I didn't mean to skip over the other stuff.
No, I quite agree.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. Yeah, okay. I keep interrupting you, so.
I just want to raise, Sam, the resolutions either at Ontario Federation of Labor conventions or at CLC conventions, I think brought together, though, and gave strength to local union leaders who were having to challenge CLC representatives in various regions across the country who were trying to dissuade local unions and local leaders from supporting SACTU, whether saying SACTU didn't exist underground or that it was communist, whatever methods they used. And at both the CLC conventions and at Federation of Labor conventions, when people got together around those resolutions, they made those kinds of, in essence, links to others, which I think gave them strength when they went back to their regions in having to deal with the continuing struggle by the CLC to find a third way, or whatever you wanted to call it.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. Again, even with the Green Jobs Oshawa thing, I tend to, whenever we're debating strategy and resolutions come up at labor centrals or the, I support them, I say it's, but I tend to poo-poo them. And the reason I do that is I think they're important for exactly what you said. They legitimate things, they strengthen things. They mean you can't be as attacked when you're just following out what looks like policy. That's very important. But I also know that what happens is that these central institutions are going to try to undermine it in informal ways. They're going to whisper about this. Yeah. They're going to say it's passed, but all those kinds of things. So I just trying to always warn people that you have to be organizing and building because the actual institutions, the formal institutions, are either going to step aside because they're not interested or actively undermining. But I do want to say, in terms of what you're saying, Jane, and I think it's an important question about its impact is, one is that there were long-time lefties who were playing an important role in this all along, and Pat Clancy especially played a really important role. I mean, Pat didn't just, I have to say for myself, I did what I could, but I was also doing a lot of other things. And Pat actually made this a priority. Yeah. Pat was a long-time lefty who grew up in a completely communist context, in the sense that he used to sit on Tim Buck's knee when he was a little kid, but he never joined the Communist Party. He always rejected its undemocratic centralism. But he always had, he was self-taught. I couldn't believe how, I searched for Clancy whenever I could. They put him off someplace in Sarnia, and I would travel there, or he would just drive in for an hour just so we could have a conversation. And I couldn't believe how well he understood the world. And on this issue, Clancy just took it on. And he was also very busy, but he took it on. So Clancy made it a priority, and that was very important. He was ready to fight at any time. It was a staff meeting, and we always had right-wing people on the staff who would raise some kind of a question. Clancy would take it on, and he had a lot of authority, and he was very effective. So Clancy was important. But I do want to say that I think that in terms of what Jane is saying, and what Brenda is nodding her head when Jane is saying, is that there were local people. Clancy was a developed lefty, on all kinds of international issues. I remember when Lula was emerging as a Brazilian metal worker before he became political, and we were supporting the Brazilian metal workers. Lula came to Canada to talk to us, and we had a meeting with Dennis, Bob, and they invited Clancy, who used to be in the opposition to them as a lefty before he came on staff. They invite Clancy. And we're having this very serious discussion about the left and politics in Brazil. And Clancy had tears in his eyes. All Clancy was thinking was, shit, this union that I've been fighting my whole life, and I've been fighting on these kinds of issues. Here I'm sitting with Lula, and we're with him. And he just had tears. So Clancy was a developed guy, but there was a lot of people who maybe heard about this, or for some personal reason were interested in the question of Africa. Maybe they were from South Africa, or maybe they were just moved by all of this, who really had to be shored up and became good activists locally. So there was a core of local activists. I don't mean them in the hundreds, but there was a core of local activists who SACTU had organized and was keeping developed because they kept them informed. The information had to be there because you're in this fight all the time with the CLC. And for those people, winning those kinds of resolutions was always important, locally at the CLC, because it was neutering the other side. But, my argument was always like, okay, the CLC is not going to go out and sell these resolutions. You have to do this. And it was always that, that's what I mean by the organizing. And that's what, that's what the SACTU committee was so crucial about. Do you know Nowitzki? Catherine Nowitzki?
Yes, Nowodzki, is it?
Nowodzki, yeah. I may not be pronouncing her name right, but she was a big activist around Palestine, but she wrote her thesis on internationalism in the trade union movement. And so she did things on SACTU as well. I don't know.
Yeah.
You might
She interviewed us, yeah.
Yeah, she interviewed, okay, yeah. Anyway, so so take what Jane said seriously. It did play a role. I'm trying to emphasize the importance of your own role, Jane, and the SACTU committee in terms of organizing. Resolutions are good and they're necessary, and there's a process there. As you also said, in terms of your own local experience, you have to win people over. It gives you a chance to talk about it. That's all really important. But it does come back to, we have to be organizing and building structures. And that was what SACTU committee was so important for.
You've done a sort of picture of a lot of the opposition you faced and where it came from. Did you have allies that you could call on outside of the labor movement or in other structures within the labor movement?
You mentioned this question of opposition. I have to tell you how I met John Harker. John Harker was the head of the CLC, International Affairs Department. And Dennis McDermott becomes head of the CLC. And we had expected Dennis maybe to make Dan Benedict the head of the department. He had actually promised Dan, I think I can say this, that he had promised Dan that he would move him in. Dan was hated by the UAW and the international the Germans, the Japanese, and the Americans at international events because of his support for third world struggles and attacks on American imperialism, and had run and lost because he had the support of everybody except the Germans, Japanese, and Americans, and that was enough to lose. So we had expected Dan to be moved in, and Dennis moved this guy Harker. And so I'm at an airport, and Dennis is passing with Harker to go to an airplane soon after he got elected. And he called me over, Sam, I want you to meet the new head of the International Affairs Department. He had just appointed him. And this is how he introduces him. He says, this is John Harker. In the United States, who would be the equivalent of the CIA plant at the Labor Federation. This is with Harker standing there. And this is how he introduces him. And, you know, he's doing it half jokingly, but completely seriously. And I think what it was, and I have to be careful saying this because I have no proof, but I think it basically was the equivalent of the State Department in Canada, the International Affairs Department, saying to Dennis that we give you a lot of money to do things, and you're not going to get this if somebody like Harker isn't appointed to that position, somebody we trust. And I think it was as simple as that, and Dennis just had to make a choice. And you know, if Bob White was confronted with that, I don't think he would have made that choice, frankly. But Dennis did. And yeah, so there was, okay, so in terms of allies, I don't really remember many allies. You know, I think my main concern was I had to convince Dennis at first when I was critical. I was always critical of the CLC. I mean, that seemed to emerge very quickly, you know, on almost any issue. But yeah, with SACTU it became very important, and with Bob White. Yeah, my main thing was, can I convince them, Bob and yeah, our own union, and you know, Clancy was an ally, but Clancy would have just been seen as somebody on the left otherwise. Yeah, of course, Clancy takes good positions. So I think that I think the strength of it was we just had a good case for anybody who was actually interested in worker struggles. But in terms of you know, help from outside, yeah, there, you know, Cup W was always good. Jean-Claude Perrault was always good. But again, somebody like Jean-Claude, he's an ally, but he's the kind of a person that if he's on a particular side, the CLC would immediately use that to isolate you, not to strengthen you. Oh yeah, you've got Jean-Claude on your side. That actually proves where you're at, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So I can't remember really, you know, I mean, you know, allies would have meant making breakthroughs in, you know, normally conservative unions, certainly not steel. I can't remember the timing on things like CUPE. CUPE was very decentralized and they often had good leaders. So there might have been moments when CUPE was good. There certainly were moments when CUPE was good. I just don't remember the timing of when it's happened. CUPE often had, you know, good progressive leaders, including, I mean, Grace Hartman from early on. And she, I imagine, would have been, I can't remember. It would be easy to check, but I imagine she would have been very supportive. But, you know, the question with somebody like Grace was a communist, but not openly, and therefore vulnerable. And people who are vulnerable were very careful about choosing which battles they should take. And there was
I think Jeff Rose was president at one point, and he wasn't going to stand up to
and Jeff
Harker
was
and the others so much, but the locals and the divisions were better.
Yeah, and so you know, somebody like Jeff Rose, I mean, again, you know, we're getting into all the sociology of union leaders and bureaucracy, but somebody like Jeff Rose was smart, progressive, well-educated, and once he retired, he was very radical. I mean, he'd say very radical things. And that was a pattern in CUPE. I mean, every CUPE leader I ever talked to, once they retired, they were lefties. I would say that about Dennis too. I mean, once Dennis McDermott was gone, he would rant and rave about the Reuther brothers as being part of the CIA. You know, I mean, not Reuther brothers, but Victor. Victor being, you know, carrying the money to fight the communists in France. But but at the time, yeah, Jeff would have been a cautious, more bureaucratic style trade unionist, try to take progressive issues that stands, but not go too far in alienating anybody. Yeah, but so that's the thing. But what Brenda's saying is right. CUPE was so decentralized that, and this is an important strategic question generally. A lot of times it's hard to get to the top and get them to take a strong position that's controversial. They're going to be worried about a lot of other things. They're going to be worried about, I don't want to alienate somebody on something that's not that important. But you can reach the locals. And the strategy has to be in organizing anything to reach the locals. And eventually the strategy, of course, is that, there is a tendency of unions to become bureaucratic. It's not automatic, and it absolutely demands pressure from below. I mean, that is the key to unions not being bureaucratic. It's not making good arguments, and it's not even electing a left person. Often, again, a left person will feel they're vulnerable, they got to be careful, they're going to be red baited. It's having locals that make a leader feel like he's being pushed, but also that he'll be supported. So organizing at the local level was another crucial strategic decision. This wasn't just organizing to get Bob White on side. That was part of it, in the same way that Jane was talking about resolutions. You wanted Bob on side, so he wasn't going to undermine it, so he was going to open doors, but then you had to do the work with the locals. That was critical, and that's a critical lesson. The one thing I'd say about that is that work at the locals level is really hard in a moment when the labor movement has been so defeated. It is so hard to do that work because so much has changed. You've got two people working in a family, so everyone is run down, exhausted, doesn't have time, is feeling insecure, so they don't feel like they have the luxury to worry about other things, is short-termist. I mean, everything that you could imagine. They're dependent on corporations. Even in the public sector, you're dependent on capital not leaving, so there'll be a tax base for everything. So it is so hard, and workers are fragmented. I talk to workers, call me from Oakville with a problem. And I said, well, if you talk to people at GM, they have the same problem. No, it's just so fragmented. And that's why a socialist party is so fundamental. That's what a socialist party does. It connects you, it gives you intellectual resources, it gives you research. So when the leader says, well, I just talked to the company and they told me this, and this is the truth, how does a rank and file worker challenge that? And I think what the SACTU committee was doing in the absence of those kinds of structures, which we ultimately will need, and SACTU could only do at a limited level on a particular issue, is they were providing that kind of base. They were giving people counter information, linking them up, giving them confidence through resolutions, bringing in international people, all those kinds of things that are those kinds of organizational things that we normally associate with a left-wing party. At a moment when there wasn't one, they were doing it.
Sam, I think there's one other thing that you can bring context to, and that is the 1980s was also a particular time where, for example, General Motors had 22,000 workers in Oshawa. And what do we have now? Maybe 2,000 at best. But there was also, so it was more powerful in a sense, but there was also this struggle between international unionism, and in the midst of the 1980s, we broke. And it made Bob White, for two reasons, a real leader well beyond the UAW, CAW, because there were other unions struggling with the international context, the US control over their direction in Canada. And I think that stature that Bob got because of the struggle that was, the basis for the film Final Offer, was really important in also the kind of stature and credibility he lent to the work in a way that we were doing in terms of opening doors with other unions, particularly at the local level, where you couldn't get into steel at the top. We got into some steel locals at the bottom, and the same with right across the country. And I think part of it had to do with that very public struggle. The other thing is, there used to be labor reporters. Bob White was in the news at least once a week on average. So there was a whole range of things happening in the 80s that kind of dovetailed with, at the time, of the work that we were doing, as well as the issue of apartheid was in the news.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This the question that, we started with, asked about how do unions that are so busy with other things find time to do this? And, this is the example of it. This is when the union was more involved in more things. It was fighting its own union. It was fighting the state, because all our collective agreements were with, all our collective agreements are actually signed by the UAW in the States. When we split, we didn't have any collective agreements. We had to go to every unit. I think we had more than 400 at the time, and get them to approve staying in the CAW. So we were fighting with the state that didn't like us splitting, because this was threatening investment from the states. We were fighting with our own union. So there's all this stuff going on. And the point is that it reinforced the SACTU stuff, as you said, rather than took away from it. The question isn't just busyness. It's that when you're in struggle, you're in struggle. So two things about it I think are worth emphasizing. One is your point about his stature. Part of what happens is that Bob becomes committed to the apartheid struggle, personally. And, Bob, when Nelson Mandela comes to office, White is invited in and has like a 2.5-hour meeting with Nelson Mandela, and they're just sitting around discussing strategy. When I go to a SACTU, not a SACTU, a NUMSA meeting in South Africa. It was a NUMSA meeting. Might not have been NUMSA at the time. And I'm listening to workers discussing whether they should retain a relationship to the international trade union movement. And one guy stands up and says, well, Bob White thinks we should. He's in it. And he's in the International Metal Workers Federation, and people start nodding their heads. Like he was known, and that had to do with things like, international positions, but it had to do with the fact that in the middle of neoliberalism, in the middle of continentalism, where we're talking about getting more integrated into the United States, in the middle of being 10% of a union where we're just a stinky little tail, we took it on, and that just gave him the stature for taking something on. And there was a lot of nationalist sentiment, because we ended up, it gave Bob the stature to lead the fight against free trade.
Yeah.
He and Maud Barlow became the official leaders of that thing. So Bob has all the status, and yeah, that spills over to Bob being able to use his credibility in a way that extends beyond his formal power. It did mean when you go to a QP local and you say, this is a SACTU committee, and the auto workers really support them, and Bob has been active, or Bob would even make a statement on it at conventions. It mattered. It gave people confidence. And that's important, because people at the local level don't feel that they're competent or confident, and they don't have the information to speak to international controversial events. So that was very important. And Bob had that kind of credibility. I'll just give you another example. Most of my experience, frankly, because you're asking me about what happened, most of my experience was actually later with NUMSA. We at one point had a program where we brought over 10 people from NUMSA to write an educational program. And first we went there, and Leo Panich came with us as part of our group, David Robertson, Peggy, myself, I don't remember who else was there. And we spent a couple of weeks talking to stewards. Then we came back to Canada and spent about 5 weeks with them living here, developing this program. And then they took it back to South Africa. And it was a radical program on the kind of radical stuff we were doing in Pell at the time. But by the time they got back, the left wasn't in charge of NUMSA anymore. And the program was thrown in the garbage under ANC pressure, because it was actually critical of the ANC. What eventually happened was one of the people who came was a very young shop steward who never said a word, quiet, completely quiet. A couple of decades later, he leads a coup in the union and takes it over. That was Irwin Jim. So there's that whole history. That does come out of this. The follow-up in terms of the end of apartheid and the relationships to unions that emerged. And I was more active in that. I'd been to South Africa a few times for educationals and for discussions. But one of the things that I remember early on is right after apartheid, Jay, Naidu, who had family in Montreal, and he'd been put into the cabinet as a key person in the cabinet, very articulate. He called and wanted to meet with Bob White and myself in Port Elgin. We drove to Port Elgin with him and his wife, and he wanted to discuss strategy. And I remember one of the things that White said to him, which I just was so impressed with because it was such a political thing to say. He said, this is wonderful that they're bringing you into the cabinet, but you have to recognize that this is now a government, like other governments, that's getting integrated into capitalism. And, they're friends and they're allies, you don't have to jump on them, but you have to retain some independence. And you have to make sure that your best people don't all go into the state and leave the unions devoid of these people. Because unless the unions stay militant and push them, you're going to get killed. Your history isn't going to matter.
Wow.
And I was just so impressed that he had the sophistication to get that. Where does this come from? Bob White had a grade 7 education. He didn't grow up in any kind of a communist thing. He did have good mentors who always preached to him the importance of independent labor. He never fully adopted social democracy. But when he said that, I was just kind of blown away. And the same thing. We had Cardenas when he was running from the left in Mexico. He came up again. It was a similar kind of thing. He came up to meet with us in Port Elgin, the two of us, and I was just amazed at both the confidence that Bob had to make these kind of strategic statements. Like coming from me, it would just be, oh, well, you're a lefty. What do I expect from you? But to hear Bob say these things was very impressive. And again, all these things come out of a certain development, which, SACTU is part of. It's reinforcing those things rather than letting them sink into what other trade union leaders were.
Can I just come back to the local level again too? And well, you're reminding me of Bob's grade 7 educational level and Pat, from an Irish working class family in downtown Toronto. But some of the actions taken at the local level, we have to remind ourselves how important they were. And they had the support of Bob White at the top. They had the resolutions and so on, but workers taking actions at the local level, I think was so impressive within the UAW, CAW at the time. And it was 85 and 86, particularly, they had these solidarity actions, like, sanctions at the workplace, more or less. We had Alcan workers, which were CASO, but they became part of CAW later. Workers at the 3M plant who had reservation agents of CAW, refusing to handle South African travel and so on. We had the communication workers and others refusing calls to South Africa, postal workers sending mail all over the country. You had these weeks of actions, and I think that the CAW, UAW locals at the time were so key to that. But they had the support. They felt they had this support from Bob White and the leadership. They had people like Pat Clancy. Pat was delivering suitcases of money into South Africa. The workers thought that was wonderful. That's where the SACTU strike fund money went. SACTU, he took the suitcase across. But and I remember particularly CASO guy, O'Brien Hyman. He was president of the CASO local at Alcan at the time. He later became part of OPSU and was instrumental in getting this South African food out of the Don jail. And then he became Fred Upshaw's assistant, right? Sadly, he died a couple of years ago, but he was typical of the workers and the locals that wanted to take action. You know, they took these things on, and they had repercussions in South Africa, no doubt, you know, Alcan and 3M and so on. So do you remember those? Do you
Yeah,
again, talk a bit about the action?
Yeah, I mean, I also remember, like, you know, Zembe, when he'd speak here, and also when, you know, when he'd come back to speak after. I mean, a couple of things I remember. One is that he wasn't shy about being critical. And that was impressive. He never had the sense of, I'm trying to win these people over, and I shouldn't sound too radical. His sense was, I'm going to lay it out. And that was a particular analysis of the moment, but also an analysis about the potentials of the working class. And I think that was very important. The other thing is, you know, I remember personally coming to the union and going to my first educationals, like, you know, in Black Lake. And what I loved most was staying up all night with these guys, listening to their fights and how creative they were. So, you know, the potential of workers, when it's encouraged and the space is there, is, you know, it's amazing. That's why we believe in socialism. I mean, socialism is only going to happen because we believe in the potential of workers to change the world. And that's the difference with social democracy. It doesn't really think workers can change the world other than knock on people's doors and raise money. And it doesn't believe the world can be changed. And you can't have, they go together. If you don't believe in workers, it can't be changed. So that potential was always there. But I guess what strikes me, and I keep coming back to this, is it's not spontaneous. It's not that, you know, workers will resist because they're defending themselves, but to think in radical revolutionary terms is not spontaneous. And the context matters so much. And once workers were defeated, you know, looking at the present moment, the scale of that defeat is immense. You know, the big defeat was that, for one thing, it came with the defeat of the left at the same time, because you can't have a left without workers in motion. But the real defeat was that they lowered their expectations. And they kind of became defensive and survival mode, which means individualism, which means they instinctively actually reinforce neoliberalism. I have a problem, I'll work more hours. I'll work through my vacation. I'll go into debt. My spouse will work more hours. So we're living right now. I'm trying to pose this historically, because I think this question changes. There's nothing essentialist about it. It's not that workers are inherently good or inherently conservative. It's that it changes in a context from what they learn. So in auto, you know, there is this history, which in the 60s was really passed on. Militant young workers who were part of the youth rebellion and anti-authoritarian were actually learning things from old workers who had formed a union and were telling them not to be stupid or they'll get fired. And the young workers saying, yeah, but you guys are just sitting around not doing anything. And it was a great dynamic. So there was this learning and dynamism that went on. And in the union, it still remained there. That's one of the differences about the 80s. In Canada, the union, you know, people think of, well, the 50s and 60s unions start getting integrated. Well, that was the American experience. You know, in the mid 50s, we were having 150-day strikes at Massey Ferguson, at Chrysler, at de Havilland, because we were trying to keep up with the Americans, and the American corporations thought of Canada as a colony, basically. You know, and that was the case with the United Aircraft strike. The big issue there was in Montreal in around 74, was that they wanted parity with the States. And the Americans are saying, why would you get parity with the States? We're 10 times your size. You don't have the economies of scale, et cetera. And so, you know, so there were these historical differences and things changed. And right now we're facing a situation where workers are demoralized, fragmented, and defeated. And to try to get them to do things that are creative would be very hard. So on the one hand, what you're saying, Brenda, support from the top is even more important than ever because they just don't have the confidence to rebel on their own or from some outside thing. But even then, what you really see in your period. So Canada is struggling, it's fighting through this period. And then when they try to change it and lower the expectations, in the States, they were quite successful. By the early 80s, the American labor movement is defeated. In Canada, it isn't. And that's part of this tension in our own union with the UAW. So we're still fighting. And in that context of fighting and people still wanting to fight, there is the spirit of shit. If someone's giving me something to fight over, they like it. It's like fun. You just kind of see what happens when there's a struggle going on. And yeah, so that was happening. So it was the encouragement at the top, the legacy of what this union had been and that it was in struggle, the legitimacy to the union, because what it was fighting for, people were actually, there was popular support for it, a certain kind of anti-American nationalism at the time. So all those things are coming together, but your role was critical to making it happen, I guess is what I'm trying to emphasize. So in terms of the particular stories, which you know far better than me, I remember, but I don't remember them, just feeling like they were unique. I remember all kinds of, that's what people were doing.
Yeah.
I remember, when I came to the union, I'll just give you an example. I remember year 1978 because of the number. At Budd Automotive in 1978, there were 78 Wildcats.
Wow.
The last time I checked, if there was one Wildcat a year in the union after I retired, that was big news. In the union, this was in one place. At Budd Automotive at one point, the union, a lot of the bureaucracy in the union happened locally. It was them learning from the top about how you do things. And they had union offices in the plant, and they began to paper them over with newspapers so nobody could see inside. One of the workers took a forklift truck and he ran over the office. If there was going to be an office in the plant, then it was going to have open windows and people could see whether they're actually representing them. And I just mean there was a spirit that when workers see that, they can be creative. I remember a young worker was talking to Jimmy O'Neill and he was saying, shit, we can't do anything. We try to do anything and somebody gets fired. And O'Neill said, did you think of cutting a cable? And he said, what do you mean? He says, next time a foreman does something to you, just cut one of the electric cables and it cuts the power off. Don't brag about it. Don't go tell him you did it because he was an asshole. Just do it. And then he'll wonder about what happens. And next time he does something, do it again. He'll get the message. And the point was that O'Neill remembers this from when he was in the plant.
Yeah.
The young workforce has no experience of it. It's not in their realm of possibilities. But, if somebody can do it by example, it begins an open question. If the union can really defend you, so it can do things, if the union encourages it. In the early 80s, and this speaks, Brenda, to the time period that you're talking about. In the early 80s, part of the defeating working class expectations was to let unemployment rise, as I said. And in the early 80s, the US let interest rate and Canada let interest rates go up to 18%. And there was mass unemployment, and we had a whole range of plant closures. And people would stand up at council, and they would say, I want to say goodbye to my friends who I've known for so long, and I'm not going to be here anymore. My plant is closing. And as more people began to say that, it stopped being pathetic and started sounding like there was anger starting to emerge. And Bob White was smart enough not to say a word. He sat there, he let this grow, and then he stood up at the end and he said, we can't let this go on. I think you know what you have to do when you go back home. That's all he said. On the way home, about half a dozen people in their cars, driving back together, planned how to take over their plant.
Yeah.
And we had about 8 plant closures in a couple of months. So, so what Brenda is saying is that when that is encouraged, when there is a sense of you have to do this and it can be done, when it's collective, so it's not just some individual being a hero, all this kind of creativity is emerging, and it was emerging around other things, and it was emerging through you guys giving it that focus, like, what can you do about South Africa? And it did emerge in places where there are local histories, like on the docks. And again, it depended on whether you were talking about the East or the West. There's all this variation. And at the local level, you always have that variation. You have somebody who has a particular history, somebody who's a particular leader. So it was part of that kind of creativity, I guess, is what I'm trying to emphasize to Brenda. And you guys, both helped develop it, because those became examples for others, even if it had nothing to do with South Africa. And you built on it. It was there. It didn't just happen out of the clear blue. So those kinds of anecdotes are really important. We saw them with the Great Boycott too. There's a lot of creative things that people could do once you're actually in struggle. And then the other thing to remember about this is the corporations are never standing still. When we get creative, they sit down and they get more creative. And what's happened for 3 decades now is they have creatively figured out how to squash rebellions inside the workplace. How you do it legally, how you do it illegally. I mean, they changed everything. For example, they used to hire foremen out of the workforce. They know the worker. They know how to run things, so you hire them. And GM built a university to hire university students who are trained in management. They know nothing about the workforce, about the operation. They know nothing about cars. And so they have, in a really sophisticated way, planned how to do this. And we haven't changed at all. In fact, we lost skills and capacities we had. So of course we're in trouble. And reviving this isn't going to be easy. I do think it's going to be explosive. I do think, as Brenda was suggesting, that once it begins to happen and you get all this shit away, the scales fall from your eyes, the fear disappears, that's what happens. I think Jane had said this once, that about just unionizing. Of course, workers are afraid. They're always afraid. They have good reason to be afraid. But all of a sudden, something happens in terms of the fear, and they just cross a line where the fear doesn't happen anymore compared to what's happening to them. And then it's an explosion. And that's how organizing actually happens. And I think that's something to generalize. The 60s were an explosion. They weren't predictable in 1962. The sit-down strikes, in the 1930s, early 30s, you can keep reading all this stuff about people saying, people are going to rebel. Are you nuts? With 25% unemployment, with people not even speaking the same language because they're all immigrants from a different place. What are you talking about? And so it surprises you. And Brenda's saying we shouldn't be surprised. The creativity's there. But it happens in that explosive, unexpected way in the right circumstances. And we have to be there to make sure it's not just like a spark that happens and then goodbye. They react and it goes away, but we can build something on it. And I think the SACTU committee can be proud of what, they built with pretty meager resources, I have to say.
Oh, wow. That's tremendous. Gwen, did you want to get in here at this point?
Put my there. Yeah, it's completely fascinating. I feel like I'm about to take this in a different direction, but I also feel like we're rapidly running out of time. So we're having this conversation now in the context of Black Lives Matter, people very openly talking about white supremacy here in Canada and structural racism. So my question is to go back to that period and ask to what extent the struggle in South Africa galvanized the labor movement here to address issues of racism here, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in terms of settler colonialism here. Did it influence the conversation about racism here in Canada within the labor movement?
Really good question. Well, first of all, the labor movement did begin in the 80s to take very progressive positions on identity politics. I mean, you could really see it at the OFL running campaigns against racism. I remember if I walked into a plant in 1974 when I came to the union, and I said, we've got a conference on gay rights in Port Elgin, you would just get snickers. Because this was like, who's this guy? You do that a decade later, you could go into the plant and the guy could be walking around with a clipboard saying, who wants to come to the gay rights conference in Port Elgin? And people just came up and signed on. It was like a non-issue. So at those levels, the union changed. And, and I think that has to be understood in a lot of changes that were going on simultaneously, conjunctural, as Doug was saying. Like, so for example, a lot of trade union leaders actually married trade union women. And the trade union women actually educated them. I can think of so many men who became feminists because of their partners, active feminists. They had some good instincts. I remember Bob Nickerson always trying to make sure that he gave the women on a committee some confidence so they could speak. But really, they're partners. They're strong women with confidence emerging. That was important. So things that were going on for a long time suddenly became relevant. The trade union movement, most of its organizing was of people of color and women. So they had to actually speak to these issues just from that self-interested way. So that was a factor. And the apartheid struggle, yes, but I think one of the really important things about the SACTU and the anti-apartheid struggle was that where the SACTU committee was coming from was a class analysis. This is really important. They weren't saying these were blacks, but they were integrating it. It was because they were blacks. There's a history of it there. They're the majority in this population in terms of democracy, but they're workers. And it was also kind of a take on slavery, that slavery didn't happen because people didn't like black people. If they didn't like black people, they would have left them in Africa. It happened because they were looking for people to exploit. And that's a very important issue now in terms of how we articulate these identity questions with class questions. I mean, it's really a critical question about the Black Lives Matter issue. And it raises two kinds of questions, I think. One is that one is just about strategy of movements. A lot of what we see is protest movements. And that's what a lot of the left has been for a long time. It's like the old left was focusing on the state and it was leaving out identity questions, racism, gender issues, etc. And those movements became protest movements. And a lot of the left ended up to be a protest movement, protest anti-globalization. It was about protests. One of the things that began to happen in this century, actually, was suddenly protests began to become more political. It was Podemos in the squares, it was Syriza, it was Sanders suddenly emerges, where people who weren't interested in politics are suddenly supporting Sanders. It's the same with Corbyn and Momentum. So there was a change going on. And the question about what Black Lives Matter is, I think, where does this go beyond protest? And that raises questions about its relationship to white workers, because first of all, its relationship raises issues within the Black community. So when you say defund the police as an example, the slogan works and everybody jumps on it. But the reality in most Black communities, every Black community that I know, is because of how they live. Of course, they're worried about their safety and they don't want to get rid of the police. There's gangs there. And so, what they're interested in is a different kind of police force that's more democratic, but they're also interested in changing the conditions, housing, education, health. And to do that, you need an alliance. And if you think of it in class terms, the alliance is a class alliance. But of course, it has to be a class alliance that says there are inequalities within our class that we have to correct. So, that's the way to bring it together, that, if we're going to say we want a class alliance, then everybody in the class has to be equal. And it doesn't just have to, again, it can't just be a slogan. It means that we are going to fight for your inequality completely, starting in our own organizations. But it has to be a class struggle. And then you can imagine it starting to be sustained rather than protests that come and go, because it's got, these these issues that have broader appeal, including in the Black community, and that can link up with unions in a particular way. And I think in that context, there has to be a lot more care given to how white supremacy is talked about. Because there's a difference between saying there are white supremacists in the United States and just referring to white supremacy as if anybody who's white is a white supremacist. That's a real problem. I think in terms of getting white workers on side who are really sympathetic, as you saw in the Black protests. I mean, that was so impressive to see the diversity in the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests against Trump. The diversity was phenomenal and the polls were phenomenal. The extent to which whites agreed. And, there was a concern about, well, what happens when there's riots or what happens when there's, breaking stuff, which Trump really wanted to exploit. Well, he didn't turn it around. There still was an awful lot of support because they put it in context. So to keep that going and to build, I think there has to be more careful discussion of white supremacy, that this is a problem within the white community and there's divisions on it and that are serious, and not just to label anybody that way. The second thing is, I think, and this gets a little bit back to what I started with and what I so much liked about what SACTU was doing, I don't think guilt is a good organizing principle. And the strategy of making whites feel bad about history, I don't think is a good strategy. It can be something, there's something to be said about, we want you to be aware of the history, but the guilt doesn't work. It has to be about, we have a common struggle and we're equal. We have to fight for equality. And how do we do that? Because, the guilt doesn't work. It's just, it's not a foundation for doing something, whereas education can be. I'll give you a very good example. I was doing a session in the Bay Area, San Francisco, with a group that was doing tremendous work with organizing home workers, both people who cleaned and people who were taking care of people in homes. And they started with organizing Black women, and then they expanded into organizing Latino women. So when I was there, they were having the strategic question, which was, there was a split between the Black and the Latino women. The Black women were saying, what's your problem? You never had slavery. And the Latino women were saying, well, you don't know what happened in our country and why we came up here. And you've been here for hundreds of years. How come you haven't been able to straighten out your problems? So they're completely divided. So the group had to decide what to do. And the suggestion that they set up a committee, and the suggestion the committee came up with was, we needed two organizations, one for Latino women and one for Black women. And fortunately, some good people absolutely rejected it, and they had a fight over it. And they concluded that what they had to do was take a break from organizing over the summer and do internal education. And they did internal education on American imperialism in Latin America and on American slavery, for both of them together in the same room. And when they went through that, the problems were solved. People got it. Whatever differences we have, you have to understand all this stuff in historical terms and in class terms and in terms of what we're fighting and how we can win. And the how we can win is critical, because one of the problems with guilt is that you're trying to mobilize people about feeling bad about something. And that still kind of leaves this white-Black split, and whites have to just defer and they can't say anything and they can't be critical of strategy. Whereas, 2 minutes. Whereas if you're fighting about how we can win, the immediate message to Blacks, like in Black Lives Matter, is, well, you can't win if you want to fight alone. If you want everybody to feel bad about why you have bad schools, maybe they'll improve them a bit, but you're still going to have lousy Black schools. You have to be fighting for universal health care, which you can't win unless you fight with everybody, alongside everybody. You can't have good education unless you have better neighborhoods, which means you have to fight over housing with everybody. So, I think that, so I think in the current context, it raises all those things. And one of the things to learn from the SACTU struggle was the way that they linked the question of apartheid and racism to the class question. And I really found, it would have been my argument, but I actually found it in practice, that when you put it in a class context, these are Black workers who are being treated like shit because of their color. They want your support. And they're not asking you to say, solve our problem. They're saying, we're fighting. We'll deal with the problem, but we want some support. And when you do it that way, you can actually win. I mean, that's the big lesson. You can win. And I think that's a really important lesson today. I'm thinking through in the debates about how Black Lives Matter, how you raise the class question without it being an excuse to not deal with racism and gender questions. And I think it's doable, but I think we get stuck when we just do it through labeling whites as white supremacists and trying to make it seem more like political correct and guilt. But I think we can do it. Okay, I'm just going to have to go soon. So,
Okay, well, can we just get one or two last
Sure.
questions in then?
Yeah. Hang
Anybody?
on one sec. Can you just hang on 1 second?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, as I say, anybody got something to bring up?
I get the feeling he really needs to go.
Okay, no problem.
I don't, by the way, mind if you wanted to do this again, although I think a lot of, as you can see, when Brenda starts making her lists of creative actions, I never document anything. And not only you guys documented, you were there, so you've got all of this. I can just confirm that it's absolutely true. You know, I can remember that as soon as this really becomes an issue, and you didn't need a lot of people, you just needed people who really took it on locally. They could win people over to it, and people actually like the creative actions. So, you know, those kinds of examples were real. And as soon as you have those kinds of creative actions on one issue, it gets it into people's heads to do them on other issues. It has spillovers when there's a strike or anything else. So sorry, you wanted to ask me something else.
I think you've done a magnificent job of giving us the view, the overview, the connections, the interconnections. It's and great lessons for the present as well. That will be very valuable. So I personally think that we could wrap this up now, and as a project, the Canadian Anti-Apartheid Activist History Project, if in fact we feel there's another level or another direction to take it, we'd really appreciate it if you wouldn't mind us coming back to you.
Yeah, I have no problem with you coming back. I'm just thinking, I guess one of the things that I did leave out, which is important, is a lot of this was institutionalized in our education program.
Yeah.
And in 1978, 79, we began to look at a paid education leave program, which was modeled on something that people had seen on a tour in Sweden. This isn't coming from me, by the way. The program emerged out of the interest of Dan Benedict played a critical role, and Gord Wilson, who's the education director at the time, played a critical role. And with a more political twist to it. And McDermott loved the idea. There was no fight about doing paid education leave. The idea was simple. We were going to negotiate a certain amount of money from in every major set of bargaining, take it as far as we could. And that money would go into a fund that would be completely administered by the union with no input from the corporations. And people would get time off to go to Port Elgin and to take a course over 4 weeks in and out, and they'd get their regular wages while they were doing it. And the point, and the timing was perfect, because 78, 79, you begin to have a transition from the old guard that built the union to a whole new generation. So it was really to develop a new cadre. And it was kind of, we actually wanted to put all our leadership through it, but a lot of the leadership wouldn't go. They felt like, we don't need education. There was a macho sense of it, and they wouldn't go. And they felt they were embarrassed if they told their rank and file that they're going away to an educational, like they needed it. So it actually ended up to be the development primarily of a cadre of new people. And again, it's one of those things that needed the support of the union. A lot of the local leadership got very nervous about it. And they would raise it at council meetings, that were teaching people they're coming back as radicals and they're criticizing us and everything else. And I remember White just saying to them, if you guys are afraid of some people getting some education and coming back and challenging you, you should resign. And he just said that to the leadership, and it shut people up basically. But the point is, there was this program, and Ken was involved, in setting up the curriculum, but it was just institutionalized generally. It meant that it was internationalist. The artwork at the center was internationalist. All of it was about international struggles of all kinds. And there was always, and it was very class oriented, very anti-capitalist, but there was always a class sensibility in it and a sensitivity to gender issues. So again, having that history of SACTU just adds to those things. It just meant that that's part of the legacy that you're teaching. And it means that people who come out of that kind of a program are sensitive to these things. In one way, it was a problem. And I just want to highlight one problem that we got out of Port Elgin, which is interesting. It's that we didn't make organizers. We were educating people, but we didn't make them into organizers. So a lot of them went back into the workplace and didn't actually want to talk to their workers. They wanted to talk to other people who thought like them. So they went and they joined something like the Cuban Solidarity Committee or worked on SACTU because, and that was a problem because their real role should have been to organize workers in the workplace. And instead they ended up doing most of their organizing work outside of the workplace. It just raises another dimension to these kinds of questions. But I think it is important that the union was open enough to understand that you needed an educational program that wasn't just about nuts and bolts unionism, about stewards training, about grievance handling, but that was political. That was actually about history, struggle, capitalism. And that, became a base for both being influenced by SACTU, because, it always had speakers around these issues, but also, just being, strengthening it and strengthening themselves. Okay.
Amazing, absolutely
Okay,
amazing. Thank
good.
you so much for that overview at the end too, because it
Good.
really is
Yeah.
essential.
Good. And it's so nice to see you guys, Brenda and
It's
Jane.
lovely to see
Yes.
you.
Yeah, I've actually seen your daughter
Yeah.
a while ago.
Oh, yeah,
I
I'm
run into her
sure.
sometimes. Okay,
Yeah,
keep well.
and your son.
Yeah, okay, keep well.
too.
Okay, see you guys.
Thank you
Have
so
a good day,
much.
sir. Have a
Bye.
good weekend.
Good. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, I'm going to turn off the recording device.